Now recording.
Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. Today we're going to have a open discussion format debate on materialism versus idealism. We'll make it more or less a roundtable format, meaning we'll let everybody have one turn on the mic before we start going back and forth. So that being said, who wants to introduce the topic? Who wants to start out this discussion of materialism versus idealism? Just step up when you're ready. Take your turn on the mic, no time limits. And then when you're finished, we'll pass it around the room and we'll go through this topic. Oh, and I forgot to say, we're the Roundtable Discord server. You can find us by Googling Roundtable Discord. You can find us on BitChute, Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, Minecraft, Facebook. You name it. BitChute, Parler. We're everywhere. So we'll see you everywhere. And on YouTube especially. So who wants to introduce the topic? Materialism versus idealism.
I could introduce it unless the Dex would prefer to introduce it.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess the way to begin would kind of be to explain dualism, as I think that's the more natural jumping off point to discuss materialism, idealism. So dualism would state that there's physical things that we directly perceive in reality. This would be everything you'd be interacting with, like from your desk to your computer to other people to your dog, right? Everything that you're sensing with your five senses and physically interacting with, that'd be material. And then there'd be immaterial things, which would naturally be thought of as, say, your consciousness, your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, things in which are not, as we would normally think of it, as spatially located or interactable, right, physically. You can't physically touch them. And then materialism would take the stance that actually everything that we think is immaterial, like, say, our thoughts and our emotions and our feelings actually can be located within space. They are physically interactable and changeable, right? They would reduce things maybe to like chemical states or neuron firings. While immaterialism would actually go a little bit farther with stating that everything is actually inherently immaterial in the way. And it would do this through John Locke's secondary and primary qualities. So it would first argue this position by saying, okay, when we look at everything and we interact with everything, we actually are dealing with things through the filter of our mind, right? So when we look at a desk, okay, we see its color, we can feel it, we can maybe smell it, has a certain smell to it, we can, maybe certain things make noises, right? And they're going through our minds, we're coming up with an idea of them, but they're not always accurate, right? Like people perceive different wavelengths as different colors, color blindness exists, hallucinations can exist, we can create things and physically seemingly interact with them, through our senses, but they're not really physically there, as in they're not interactable with other people. Illusions exist, right? I mean, I can put a stick through water and it can appear bent to me, even though it is still straight as it is in the water. Not to mention, too, like same things, as I was saying with colorblindness, can create different experiences and different qualities for different people, right? Like if I put my hand in water, right, it could be cold, but if my hand is cold and I put it in water, it could be warm, or maybe a food tastes sour to one person and it tastes sweet to another. So what's its true quality? These seem to be secondary things that are up to the interpretations and filterings of our minds. But John Locke would state that things still have primary qualities, right? Like the shape of the desk won't change. But yeah, again, I would say this even changes. And Berkeley, who's considered the founder of idealism, would say this as well. Like, for instance, if I move away from an object, it can be perceived as smaller, or say under certain effects of drugs, or even looking at things through a weird perspective, even the shape of it can appear to be malleable and change. So everything seems to be filtered through our mind and just simply be ideas in which we're interacting with mentally. But then he would say, okay, well, if everything is ideas in which is being interacted with, and we're never interacting with anything directly physical, the primary quality of objects, then what really is physical? Is there anything there? Like, for instance, if I'm imagining a tree, can I describe a tree without using something that's filtered through my mind, without using my five senses? If I try to do so, would there be anything? Well, there would really be nothing if I'm trying to describe it in any way outside of things that are filtered through my mind. So John Locke would say that everything is actually primarily a creation of consciousness and our minds. And he would rectify this with other people by saying that reality is coming forth as an idea from a subconscious, you could say, in which then we're experiencing, other people would be experiencing. He would say that this would be God, in which reality emanates from, and then we interact with and experience. Similar to a simulation, for instance, like in the Matrix.
Sure thing. So before I want to get into my statement, I would love to thank Zetran first for waking up and Volpus for even agreeing to do this, and the Roundtable for hosting us. And I would encourage everyone to go on the Twitch, as it does like support the channel. I just posted it in general. However, see, the thing is with idealism and dualism, right? It's just a thing. It's kind of, they get to the God. It's kind of like a God in the gaps argument, in that we don't know what does this, therefore it must be like God. In this case, it must be dualism. Like the examples cited were like illusions, emotions, like something being cold, right? The thing is, first of all, with emotions, we just don't know. We just haven't like found it out yet, and we kind of actually already do know, and that it's being they're chemicals, right? So this is why we have certain drugs to treat these chemical imbalances, right? We just don't know fully how we have our emotions. That doesn't necessarily imply that they are some sort of metaphysical thing. And the thing is, with metaphysical things, as soon as we're able to measure, like not metaphysical things, but things in idealism that are immaterial, as soon as we're able to measure them and measure their impacts on other things, they become inherently materialistic, because we can observe them with some sort of sense data. And the thing is, the reason we have the word illusion is because we all understand that materials have some inherent physical properties, right? This is the reason we have it. And having an illusion doesn't necessarily prove that it's some sort of immaterial thing. It just proves that we're receiving sense data in an incorrect fashion.
Perhaps I can jump in here, if it's all good.
Yep, sounds good.
So, well, where to start? I suppose I'll be taking the position in this conversation of something approaching idealism. To me, this is to say that it doesn't matter how complete or objective sciences or rational enterprises become, the seat of action and the seat of responsibility is and will always be subjective. It'll be from the perspective of the dot or the point behind the eyes and in between the ears. And I heard something there which was off Dex, which was a how can I say it without it was an error, I'd say. By that I mean the world itself in its metaphysical, how can I say, properties will not become materialistic upon the completion of science, the completion of the project. Because, and maybe somebody would like to argue against this when I'm finished, because the seat of experience will be always a subjective seat. In fact, and finally I'll say, when the completion of science occurs, when all objective properties are listed, at least pragmatically, then we'll enter into a radically new experience of something we can't even imagine right now, I'd say. Yeah. Maybe someone else would like to jump in there.
I'd like to respond to something Dex said, unless we're still going to pass it around to different people. I'm not sure. I guess then I'm just going to go ahead and respond. So to Dex, one thing that I was kind of interested in, you were talking about how, okay, we have these chemical reactions or these machinations of the mind in which result in different things, right? Like we know if certain parts of the brain is damaged, then we're going to have certain falls in cognition, right? Like if your hippocampus is damaged, you're not going to be able to remember things as well. If your frontal cortex is damaged, you're not going to be able to make decisions maybe as well or be as rational of an operator. We know that, you know, certain things happening within the brain correspond with certain mental states and thoughts, feelings, right? But I think there's a great disconnect between, you know, these, say, chemical reactions or neural firings and the actual experiences in which they create. Or say like something like, okay, like a lot of people like to say color is a certain wavelength that can be observed, right? But yet there's a disconnect between the wavelength and the actual experience of redness, right? Like say if I state everything about the wavelength and everything that is red without actually seeing red, I would still lack the knowledge of what red is, because red would be a personal thing that have to be experienced to be understood, right? You can't logically explain to a blind person color. You know, it's a qualia in which has to simply be experienced to be understood. And these things, right, aren't spatially located. The actual experience of redness, even though the wavelength in which causes the experience can be located, the experience can't be located. spatially, right? Because Leibniz said for two things to be identical, right, they have to have all properties in common. And immaterial things like thoughts and feelings, okay, aren't spatially located as far as we can tell. We can pinpoint things in which coincide with the experiences, right, and correlate, but yet these things that seem to cause these experiences, even though we can't explain step by step how this transpires, are still not in and of themselves the experience. And this experience, right, your thoughts, your consciousness, the mental picturing of redness, for instance, isn't spatially located, right? Your feeling isn't spatially located. Like to say, okay, love, for instance, has an XYZ coordinate. To a lot of people, would seem kind of absurd, right? To say that experience has a spatial location. Not to mention, too, emotions and thoughts have intention. So, okay, say my computer were to break, all of a sudden the internet would go out right now. I'd probably be pretty pissed about that. And I would be pissed about the computer breaking, right? I'd have an intent about that. Yet material items aren't seen to have intention. Like, how can a rock or atoms be about something, have intention? That seems to be a little bit absurd to see that being the case, where physical things can have these qualities of these immaterial properties such as emotion, right? So these would be kind of two problems with what you were saying to me. And just to say like, oh, well, it's got other gaps, and therefore, consequently, you're just using this to explain this away kind of like ad hoc, I think it's a little bit disingenuous, because I think you're never really going to get past the problem of the fact that knowledge at its core is obtained through experience. And you're not going to get away from the fact, too, that everything is experienced through the filter of your brain, which we know to be faulty and, non-reliable, really. And therefore, consequently, our reality is always going to be on a level subjective to our own experience and, never really fully verifiable as to its true nature. I mean, Kant got to this as well, right? He would say that the true reality, physical reality, it may well exist, but we're never going to be able to describe it or know it in any objective manner, because we simply have no way of objectively interacting with it, because we're always going to subjectively view things through the filter of our faulty minds.
Okay, so I'm just gonna hit on a few things. Okay, so my whole problem with this is that nothing can be metaphysical, or rather, we can't even know if something metaphysically does exist, because if we're ever able to measure it, it just becomes materialistic by definition. See, the thing is, just because someone would lack the understanding of red without knowing about it, this doesn't really matter, right? Because we can measure red. This makes it inherently materialistic, right? Just because you fail to understand how to ride a bike doesn't mean that riding a bike is like an action that's materialistic, an action that we can measure, that we can reliably predict, and we can just use for further things. I mean, yeah, and hitting on that, just because people experience things different does not make it so that it's not material, right? It just, they interact with these variables in different ways. It doesn't mean the variable is not present. Again, it could well be that is we have a very immaterial world. However, we simply just can't know this.
Ztran, would you like, or Ztran, I'm not sure the exact time. Do you want to respond first, or should I respond?
I will say that the issue of dualism, in any sense, is that it breeds a normativity, and that normativity breeds something akin to fascism. By that I mean ethical fascism, not economic fascism. If you set yourself up in contradiction to something else, whether it be in ethics, in neurobiology, and whatever it may be, this will create a comparative point off which you jump and claim yourself to be the correct position. Deleuze said it quite right. He said, as soon as someone disagrees with me, he goes, well done, let's move on to the next thing now. And he didn't mean anything trite by this small gesture. The point of disagreement, to him anyway, was a way of his view of disagreement was that dualism, the way that people disagree, the reason that people disagree is to build. Okay, I'll put it this way. Imagine you have three opinions in an entire set of opinions. Say you have a subject to do with, for example, this. You have three major camps. You have the ideal, which is to say that the seat of experience is the builder of the seat of subjectivity is the seat of it. I just woke up here, guys. My apologies. You have idealism, which says that the consciousness is the metaphysical thing, that's the starting point. You have materialism or realism, which will say that reality builds the mind, or reality, the outside world, builds the mind. And then you have the third camp, you'd say, which is yeah, you know what? I'm gonna make some tea. I really apologize.
It's all good.
I guess I'll just pick up a little bit where he left off, unless you have something to respond to that, Dex.
You can go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say about redness, right? You're talking about, studying the wavelength and how it causes, but yeah, you have no way of really knowing what my experience of redness or the color is, right? Like, how do you know the color in which I'm experiencing and imagine is the same as your color, right? You would have to see into my mind and experience things as I experience it to know it, right? We can both point and study the same wavelength and its scientific interactions, right? Like, for instance, I know the plants are the specific color they are because it enables them to get the best energy from the sun in order to perform photosynthesis, right? Those are the physical interactions, but the actual conscious experience and how we perceive those wavelengths, right, is going to be something unique. It's going to be something that you're not going to be able to see or interact with. You're not going to physically locate it. And simultaneously, with other things, like I was saying with emotion, you're not going to be able to describe how a bunch of physical things could then go through a process to then acquire intention and be about things like they are. So I mean, that's my kind of main objection with that. And simultaneously too, okay, right now all I'm doing is trying to prove that some things are immaterial to kind of counteract his idea that everything is material. But to go further and kind of support my own viewpoint that everything is ultimately material, because everything is the experience of our minds and our ideas of reality. It's our, mentally created simulation, I suppose you could say, of whatever, of reality maybe or is. Is the fact, can you describe anything without using your five senses, without using mind-filtered data? Like, for instance, try to describe a tree to me, or, the room in which you're in without using any of your senses or anything that is done through the filter of your mind, right? You're not going to be able to. None of that, this quote-unquote physical reality or things that exist independent of what you're thinking cannot really be described or interact with in any meaningful way, because we have no way of doing it outside of the subjectivity of our minds and our consciousness. And so consequently, the only reality in which we live in and we interact with is the mind-created one. It's the simulated one. And so consequently, there could be like concepts of physical reality or a true reality outside of what we're experiencing, but we have no way of proving that or interacting with it or describing it in any meaningful way.
Sure thing. So this very, very deep subject now. Okay, so number one, you can't know whether we experience the same thing. Well, that doesn't necessarily matter, because we still know a constant is going to be the same thing. We still know that red will be red. We still know that blue will be blue. Whether like those are certain frequencies, is up to the color. But we know that these things exist even outside of human beings existing. And the thing is, this is why I kind of say it's kind of the gods and the gaps argument, right? Just because we don't know the specific mechanisms of how someone perceives something does not make it immaterial. Rather, we can. I'm actually sure that we can see how people experience things based on how the neurons fire. We can know whether you're in pain. We can know whether you're happy. We can know whether you're sad. So in some rudimentary sense, at least for now, we can know how you do experience with something. And just because the describing the tree without senses, that doesn't mean that the tree is still not a tree, even if we are gone, right? And that is we can see, this is why I say I'm agnostic to material idealism and dualism, is because we simply can't know. However, it's much more pragmatic to be a materialist, because if I'm making policy on constants that I see without me, if I know that if I give someone food that they'll be able to eat and they'll be able to survive, there could be.
Oh, you cut out a little bit. Is your mic working?
You might have wrote.
Sorry. I just sorry about that.
Continue, Dax, please.
What's up?
I said continue. You were on idealism and materialism. Okay.
Yes, sir. So I was hitting on a point. This is my strongest point too. So it's much more pragmatic to be a materialist, because if we can see and we can understand how variables interact with each other, we can make the best forms of policy. We can act in the best in the best way. So it's not only is it not pragmatic to be a dualist or even an idealist, but it's just we simply can know whether things of the immaterial do exist, because as soon as we do know, by definition, they are material. We can measure them using sense data and stuff like that.
Okay, well, there's two responses to what I had to say. For one, you're talking about how we can observe mental states, right, based on behavior, right? So, for instance, we can tell after certain neuron firings or certain mechanisms of the physical brain, right, that people can act in certain ways. They're going to smile, they're going to behave positively, right? Or maybe they're going to behave sadly and they're going to frown. But you have to keep in mind, right, you're never actually seeing into the real mechanisms of the mind of what they're really thinking or what their consciousness is doing. Like, it's perfectly feasibly possible that, they could, for instance, be what would be called a philosophical zombie, right? Where they'd be displaying all these outward stimuluses and these activities in which would hint at conscious behavior, but yet in reality they would not be conscious. Think of, like, for instance, a really intelligent and complex machine, right, or android, for instance, that is following all these various steps and algorithms and is displaying all this behavior, right, like a puppet. But then simultaneously is actually blank mentally, is not really thinking at all. It is just appearing to be thinking. And so consequently, just because you can look at behavior, you can look at outside things, unless you're actually experiencing things the same way somebody else's might be experiencing, you have no way of knowing if they're conscious or there. So I think that's a little bit flawed. And not to mention, too, there is actual pragmatic value to being an idealist or being a dualist. For one, if you view things in a materialist world, this is going to actually view your outlook on life and your philosophy. For instance, materialism, I think, becoming really popular in the West has led to a big decline of religion, for example, right? Where people no longer view spiritual things as possible because they think everything is grounded in this physical material world, right? So they would laugh at the idea of ghosts or spirits or a god or deities, right? Or something outside of this realm of existence, okay? Because they think, well, everything has to exist within this realm, right? So what room is there for God if everything's material or physical? And then that's going to, of course, as they leave religion, have, social implications, political implications, and affect our entire reality, how we live about our lives. So I think there's a lot of practical considerations and effects that come from this philosophy.
Okay, so few things to hit on. So you can never really see the mechanisms of the mind. Again, this is sort of like the God in the gaps argument. Because you see a gap in science, you instantly assume that, therefore it must be immaterial. Like, I can point to all kinds of things. Like, it used to be like, the weather. That's like very like, the spirits do this and it's very immaterialistic. But no, we can like measure this. We can see how variables interact. The same goes here, right? This is just God in the gaps argument. Well, something of the keen, right? Okay, so then there's a lot of things that can look conscious, but isn't. I would wager this 100% that any doctor could look at 2 brain scans and be able to determine who is conscious and who is unconscious. I really give heavy doubt to this. Now, your outlook on life. See, the thing is, religion did not decrease because of materialistic. I think it's just the rhetorics that atheists have been pushing, and it's just like the lack of data that there is of a God. And I wouldn't even say you can be a materialist and still believe in God. In fact, God has to inherently be material in order to have an impact, in order for us to measure him in any sense of the way, in order for us to experience with him. So the thing is, any religion, every religion can believe in materialistic values, and this is not the reason why the religion has really skyrocketed down. I think there is even more Christians than there was now. I would have to look that up, but that's not the reason, definitely.
So, you're saying it's a temporary gap of scientific understanding and capability, but yet how is science ever going to get past the fact that how are they going to spatially locate my emotions and my feelings and my conscious experience, right? I mean, sure, they can point to synapses firing between each other. They can point to chemical reactions, and which seem to coincide with what people self-report as various experiences or mental states. Yet, how are they actually going to know and locate and experience things the exact same way I'm going to experience it? That seems to be outside the possibility of any future sci-fi science. That seems to be impossible. Not to mention, how are they going to explain in the future how a bunch of immaterial things starting at the molecular level can then cooperate and work together in order to create intention or have desire or have consciousness, right? That that also seems to be far from the capabilities of science. Not to mention, too, science as well seems to describe some things as, they're not really able to describe it in a physical sense. It almost seems to imply that consciousness has an effect on it. I know quantum mechanics, I don't really want to go into that because a lot of times people go in quantum mechanics, it turns into like quantum blue and we don't really know what we're talking about. But, I mean, there are cases, okay, for instance, where something that would normally be a physical particle, right, where they did something called the double slit experiment, where they would shoot a particle through these splits, and they would expect that the particle would either hit the barrier or would go through one of two slits, and it would create just a straight line where they'd be observed to be. But instead, they would shoot one particle at a time, and it would appear to go through both slits simultaneously, interact and interfere with each other, and create this huge wave pattern of interference in different positions of this particle, where it seems to be even interfering with itself somehow physically, where it just turns the energy when it's not observed, but then when it is observed, then all of a sudden it behaves as you would normally expect, where the particle goes through one slit or the other, and it goes through two straight lines. So then there's all types of other weird happenings that don't seem to be purely physical and seem to be affected by things outside of our full understanding. So I don't know. I don't really see this as a God of the gaps argument. I just see this as something that science is never going to really be able to answer or cover.
Yeah, and people used to think that science would never be able to explain how babies come about. They were like, oh, the the way in which babies are made, this is something magical. This is something only God can do. We can never figure it out. But now, lo and behold, that we did figure it out given enough time. And the thing is, we have already begun to locating how these experiences happen. We know how memory happens, that being the neurons firing in a certain pattern. We know about chemical imbalances on the brain and how they give you your emotions. And like what you experience is the effects of these neurons. What you experience is the effects of these mechanical interactions with your brain. That's why, like, people would, if you had no brain, you wouldn't be able to experience these things because, you don't have like a physics. You can't understand it, right? And then, again, we can get into religion and we can dig into that rabbit hole as well. Wait, and quantum mechanics, the whole reason, I'm pretty sure most of this stuff is theory in quantum mechanics, but even the stuff that we do know for sure is based upon measuring certain things. Just like the studies that you cited in which particles split into two or something turned into matter when it wasn't observed, but energy when it was. The reason we can understand that these particles split into two is because we can measure them materialistically. And like, even if we like that's the whole crux of the whole conversation, right? As soon as we're able to measure something, as soon as we know it's a variable's impact upon other variables, makes it inherently materialistic.
But Dex, would you acknowledge, though, for instance, okay, when there's chemical firing, do you acknowledge that the thoughts and emotions which we experience that seem to coincide and be the result of these, based on neurological science, are still different from these firings? You would agree with that, right?
Well, no, I would say how you perceive the world, how you think about stuff, how you picture stuff in your head is the effects of these neurons, right? So it's kind of like your brain decides to do something, and then therefore you just participate in that action.
Okay, but the effect, you would agree, is not the same as the firing or the chemicals or the electrical, I guess, communication in the neurons, right? You would agree? Like when I think cheeseburger or I feel like love, for instance, that's not the same as the chemical reactions.
No, so I would say when we describe love, right, this is a social construct we put on a feeling that we get from these chemicals, right? So we use different words to describe it, but at the end of the day, they are the same things. In the same way that ham and putting ham, cheese, and bread together is the same thing as a burger. It's kind of like this, in which your feeling is the same thing of the effects of the neurons firing, the effects of the chemicals in your brain.
Right, so you're saying the experience I have of love or the experience I have, say, of redness, right? You're saying that's the exact same thing as, the chemicals or reactions that result in this feeling, or, for instance, red is the same thing as the wavelength? I mean, are you trying to claim that? I mean, like, okay, you can locate the wavelength, but how do you explain one wavelength making somebody self-reportedly see, like, say, green instead of red, right? Like, there's this disconnect between the actual experience of these things and the fact that they're not really spatially locatable and they're unique to us, and the things that seem to coincide or correlate with them occurring.
Wait, so can you so just because you react to the color red differently does not mean red is not a materialistic thing. right? Or it doesn't mean that your reaction to that isn't materialistic, because at the end of the day, the whole time you're thinking thoughts or your brain is responding, these are neurons firing in the brain.
Okay, but so say I'm experiencing emotion like love or anger, or I'm thinking something consciously, right? Where spatially located is that? Because, okay, like when I'm looking at a red pen right now in my hand. Okay, and yeah, there's certain wavelengths that are being emitted by this that are going into my eye and then being perceived as redness, but the actual perception, the experience of redness is not the wavelength in and of itself. There's a disconnect between the wavelength and the experience and the qualia, right? Like somebody could study everything about the wavelength and know everything about the wavelength, but unless they actually have this unique experience, they know nothing about redness as it is, right? There's this big gap between the two. I don't see how you can correlate the two, or say the two are synonymous. They don't have the same properties.
Yeah, right? Oh, sorry, I thought you were done. Continue.
Oh, no, I mean, I guess you can go. I mean, I'd like, okay, for instance, when I have the neurological firings that result in my conscious thinking, right? The neurological firings can be spatially located, but yet my conscious thinking, the actual experience that's caused seemingly by this neurological firing is not spatially located. You can't say where, okay, love is right here, X, Y, Z, or when he's having this thought, right, when he's thinking about what to say next, okay, all those thoughts that he's having, they're located X, Y, Z right here. They're the same thing as this, when they're not.
Okay, so few things. So just because one second. I absolutely agree with you. There is a disconnect between the wavelength of red and experiencing it, right? So the thing is, with the experiencing part, not only do you have the wavelength of red, but your eyes are interpreting that information, and your neurons are firing in a way in which you can perceive it. And I would say, okay, like we can't spatially locate where you think words, at least not yet, right? But that doesn't necessarily matter. Because we know how these variables arise, right? So we know that they exist, they're material. We can sense them. But do you understand that though? Like, because the reason you think red is because of neurons firing in the brain.
Right, well, there's the dualistic position, right, where even if, say, these experiences are going along for the ride after all these various processes that happen, that still doesn't detach from the fact that these things are still immaterial and they still exist, right? And then from an idealist perspective that I would take as well, I mean, you're going through the filter of your mind to tell you about how your mind works, right? You're going through the filter of your consciousness to explain this physical process and how it all operates. Meanwhile, this could be a completely unreliable narrator. It could not be truly showing how things are innately at their core, right? What their core essence, true essence really is, what the true reality is. And so consequently, I mean, from everything coming from experience, as the basis of knowledge, I don't see how you can really prove that that's the objective truth, because you're not looking at things from an outside perspective. You're seeing everything through the filter and subjective experience of your mind, which has been proven to be faulty and unreliable. So I don't think you're going to ever, you can see things as they work in this, reality as you experience it, as you think of it, but yet the objective true reality, you're not viewing it from an objective third position. And I don't think your science is ever going to be able to get you outside of the fact that you're seeing things through this filtered position.
So are you on a subjective or an objective idealistic stance?
What would exactly be the nuance difference?
Okay, no, subjective. Okay, so in ontological philosophy, when you're dealing with idealism, you talk about subjective idealism. We say that we have a starting point, and then we say that an object exists from that starting point to the extent that it is perceived by someone, right? So SAS percipi, or whatever the Latin phrase is, it's basically saying to be is to be perceived, and that's subjective, which is like of the individual. And then you have objective idealism, and objective idealism is it says that the existence of an object consciousness, which is existing before and in some sense independently from human consciousness. So it's like it exists by its own type of thing.
I suppose I'd be more in line with Berkeley that to be is to be perceived. So I mean, it is that everything that exists, right, is going to have an experience or somebody experiencing it and interacting with it, or I guess conjuring up the ideas, I suppose, some sort of consciousness. And so consequently, if you can't think of something, if something's consciously not thinking of it, then does it really exist, right? Like, can you describe what a tree is without using doing it through the filter of consciousness, right? Using your senses to describe it. Because if you didn't do so, then what would even be there? It would just be nothing. So I suppose I would take more on that line. I mean, to be honest with you, this is more a hobby to me. I never like officially taken philosophy classes, so I guess I don't know like the full nuances of everything. But that seems to be more in line, I guess, subjective idealism. Do you know, by instance, Lucian, what Kant was? Was he subjective as well?
Okay, so Immanuel Kant. Let me look. I'm looking through my notes. So he presented a formalistic or transcendental idealism. That was the idea of like the human self. We have a transcendental ego, this idea of a higher consciousness. So he's on idealism, but the way he's describing it is kind of, it's in the Kantian ethic philosophy bubble. So, but no, I would say he's more on the subjective idealism of things.
Yeah, I guess I'd be more in line with Berkeley than in Kant. Because, okay, I'll agree on a level that there could be a physical world, there could be a more objective world that's outside of what we're experiencing. That is possible. I'm agnostic to that viewpoint, but I would say that the world we interact with is completely from the ideas of our own mind, and we're always seeing things through the filter of our mind. And whatever that objective or real world would be, we have no meaningful way of describing or truthfully saying what it is, because we would have to be outside of the filter of our mind to do so. And I don't care what the scientific advancements are going to happen in this millennia to come. I don't think we're ever going to be able to see things not through the filter of our mind and get away from it and see it from a third position. I don't see that happening personally.
See, the whole, at least my criticism, and I think this is a very heavy criticism, is that we simply cannot know if something immaterial is existing, because if we do know that, then it becomes materialistic, is because we can sense it. And I if you have a refutation, I would like to hear one for sure.
Okay, I guess the best way to try to refute this a little bit would be to say, what's your evidence for the physical world exactly? What is there that is not through the filter of your mind, created by your mind for you to experience? Okay, like for instance, when you look and observe data and information, what there is not done through secondary qualities or through something that essentially is immaterial in nature?
Well, I would say that like people being able to experience things like broadly across like all humankind, to have every single human understand that a fire is like very hot and you will burn, your skin will burn, and knowing that every single human being knows what an inch is, or at least knows like what space is, like it can like know that they can walk on the ground, them being able to touch something like that is my evidence right there, that these are like constant throughout all of human experience, and not only human experience but all of animal experience as well.
Right, but how do you know this isn't simulated by your mind and simply just
okay
this? Oh, what do you want to say, Lucian?
No, so in order to to make the pure idealist claim and say that it's not simulated by your mind, you have to refute this idea. You have to refute like all the materialistic arguments, which is the idea of A, there is some type of single type of matter that fundamentally makes up everything. B, there is like some type of an atomos, where it's like the Greek idea of the smallest particle that makes up something that exists outside of your mind. Or C, you have to completely reject that, that there is no intrinsic properties to reality. There is no substance of reality. There is no, I think the phrase is, it's a prima materia, which basically says that like there is nothing outside of you and of yourselves. And I think personally, one of the biggest problems with that type of perspective is that you almost start falling into a God complex, where it's like, if none of these other things exist, then how do I know that people in their perceptions, they aren't just a projection of my mind? If I cannot hold that the physical reality in which I reside physically exists, then these physical embodiments of other individualistic human beings with all their, functions and personalities and everything they come, as their philosophical makeup, it's like, how do I know that isn't just some other kind of thing that, I can dismiss with my reality as well? It's like, you don't get to do both.
And I think this is the problem, right? We simply cannot know this. We cannot know whether our world is materialistic. We cannot know like whether solipsism is true or not. We can't know if everything is idealistic. And I think that's when it gets to the pragmatic point. So I think that's why materialism is just sorry. Materialism is just pragmatically better, because if we're able to accept that we should only make go Volpus, just go ahead.
Oh, dang. Hopefully we're not getting too sick, Dex. But I don't know. I mean, falling into solipsism definitely can be a problem with idealism. Although I believe one of the best arguments against solipsism would be by Wittgenstein, right? The linguistic argument that states that the existence of language and the fact that there is this system of communicating between other minds, and the fact that as we communicate, we can infer and know what people are meaning and referring to when they bring up these words, implies the fact that other minds exist. For why would a language exist if there weren't other minds to communicate with, and how can we understand these words, I suppose, and what they're inferring to if other minds didn't exist? I'm not super familiar with the argument, but I think that's probably the best you're going to get, even if you could find flaws. Lucian, do you know much more about Wittgenstein and his linguistic argument against solipsism?
I actually do not.
So I do want to hit on this. Hopefully, if my COVID doesn't hit me back. I do not have COVID, by the way. But damn, did I really forget? No, okay. So I think we just simply can't know this now. And I think it gets to the pragmatic point about what's better, right? So the thing is, it's much better to rely on things that we can measure, to rely on things that we can perceive, because we make policy in a much better way, right? When we rely on things that we can't measure, that we can't know about, that's when things start getting very bad in a policy point. You know what I mean? So I think pragmatically, it's much better to be a materialist much better than an idealist or an individualist as well.
Well, I think one that's going to get very subjective on what type of world you want to be created, because I think, the resulting social consequences of believing in idealism versus materialism create vastly different societies that one could prefer or not prefer depending upon, their stance in life. But simultaneously, too, this has nothing to do with whether or not one is true or not, right? Just because one maybe is better for policy making or would create the world you want to see doesn't make it true. So I don't really see how that has to do with whether, one is factual or not, or one is, the better argument or not, the secondary effects come completely after that discussion.
Oh, so yeah, I absolutely agree. But the problem is we can't know, right? The thing is, we can argue about this, but at the end of the day, no one knows if it's materialistic or if it's idealistic or it's dualist, right? So the thing is, that's when we got to look at the effects of what our beliefs do to us. You know what I mean? And that's why materialism just comes up on top. The thing is, you can't prove to me that. Did someone talk?
That was me. I was just going, but sorry, I'll shut up.
Sure thing. No, it's fine. So you can't prove to me that immaterial things exist, nor can I prove to you that we're not in some what do you call it? What's that one movie? The Matrix.
The Matrix.
I can't prove that we're in some sort of Matrix. You know what I mean? So we got to look at the other effects that it has.
Well, I would just say, as far as experience goes, you would agree that, okay, when you look at items, when you deal with the five senses that you perceive from them, that these can be subject to different experiences, right? Like somebody who even goes up to a fire, for instance, if their neurons aren't working properly, they're not even maybe potentially going to be able to sense the pain that could result from that even, right? Or, okay, when we look at certain objects, right, colorblind people are going to see things a different way, or perhaps somebody with different taste buds are going to taste food, or perhaps they have a different mental state about it, they're going to taste it differently, right? Like I could taste one fruit and you could say it's sour, I could say it's sweet. Or, okay, I put my hand in a glass of water, right? I could say it's cold, but if your hand's cold, maybe you say it's hot. So would you agree that there's subjective secondary qualities that's going to be unique to the person, that's going to differ from what it is in reality?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why is because they have different variables. I think twins actually prove my point very closely. So the thing is, if you have two twins that were raised in the same exact environment and are very similar, they're going to have much more similar experiences with certain things than someone outside related to them. This suggests that it is a materialistic thing. And then another point you can hit on this is that if you would have the same person, right, with the same exact brain, with the same exact experiences, with all the variables being the same exact, there would be no difference in how they perceive something. And I would even posit there would be no difference in the way in which they express themselves, in the way in which they interact with their variables. You know what I mean?
Okay, but you would agree, though, that these secondary qualities, the five senses, are going to be different within somebody's mind as they mentally experience it. And as far as we can tell right now, we can maybe, try to explain through a neurological model how this has caused these experiences, but the experience itself is not spatially located, right? You would agree with that? Just yes or no, because I want to go on to a different point after this.
Surely, but no. So because they have different variables, right? So the reason why someone's going to interact with something differently is because their brain is set up differently, their genetics is different, or the thing they're experiencing it in is different. Their variables are different.
So okay, what would be the true color of an item if one person sees it as green, one person sees it as red? Like, what's the objective color?
Okay, so that I'm going to step in for you, Dex. The objective color would be like the scientific measured color for the wavelength that is distinguished by the light reflecting or off that object.
Okay, but there's the wavelength that's objectively true for, but what's the objective experience of that wavelength?
Sure thing. So they would both have that objective experience. It's not mutually exclusive that one person can perceive something to be green and one person to perceive something as red. However, the wavelength that comes off of it has to be one thing. However, their neurons can fire differently because of the different variables in their environment. So it's not mutually exclusive that someone perceives something to be green while another person perceives something to be red.
Okay,
another problem with this argument is that it all depends upon the distance that you observed and the speed that you're going. And I mean, that's why we have relativity and the Doppler shift and all these other kind of phenomenons. It's like when you want to say that something exists, as an object being of a specific or a certain type of variety, shape, form, color, volume, then it's like, okay, yeah, and we are all going to have our own personal perspectives on that. But I think at the end of the day, we all agree that that material object exists. However, with the idealism, and I want to hear this argument, and maybe I'm trying to drag us into something else, but with the idealism, it's like you mentioned earlier how solipsism, it kind of, there's arguments against that, but my thing is like, look, man, I don't understand how you get to conclude that there is something existing external while you are subsequently trying to disprove that there is nothing external, if you know what I'm saying. I can expand on that, or you can continue on this little tangent.
As regards to solipsism, I mean, that's not a direct refutation of idealism. It's just an interpretation of what would follow as a consequence of idealism, potentially. And so I would be agnostic to it. Maybe there is only one mind. I couldn't really tell you the existence of other minds because I can't experience other minds. I can see hints at other minds or suggestions, and I can put faith into that other mind exists because of that, right? Like I can see the fact that language exists, right? That seems to imply that there's other minds and they need to express things in which they're privately experiencing to other individuals. Or I can look at, displayed behavior. But, whether or not everyone's a philosophical zombie or we're all on the Truman Show and they're all fucking with me, I mean, I can't objectively prove to you whether or not that's false or true. So, I mean...
So, the moment that you start to reject this idea of a lack or just the non-existence of some type of external form of reality is subsequently the moment when I want to inject the argument about what is the difference between reality and a dream.
Well, the difference between reality and a dream, I suppose, would be the consistency and order of it, right? Dreams tend to be very chaotic, and they tend to be, short-lived, and they tend to be sporadic. They have no consistency. They follow no external laws and forces in which govern them, and they don't have the same continuity as our experienced reality. But I mean, in a way, though, they are experienced and real, and just not in the same way or in the same realm as the general, more, I guess, lived-in reality.
But your argument right there was just based on external experiences. And that's why I'm like, hey, wait a minute.
They're still private experiences. They're just in different states of mind, I suppose. I'm still working on my own personal experiences to distinguish the two. I personally experienced this reality where I'm awake and I can tell, hey, there's all these different forces and orderly facets to it. There's all this continuity that's experienced. I know my dreams don't have the same level of, depth and detail, right? Like, for instance, there's a lot of tricks to tell it's a dream, right? You look at the clock doesn't move, or something bizarre happens in the dream that conflicts with how things are perceived in the more awakened world, right? There's all these different tricks people use when they do like lucid dreaming to tell that it's a different reality than the one in which they're normally in. And so that's how you'd be able to differentiate the two. You work on your own personal experiences. I'm not using anything external outside of my mind to do that.
But I mean, as a materialist, I would just say your neurons are firing differently. So therefore you experience something different.
Right, but my experiences, we could do this like all day, but like my experiences still aren't those firings, right? There's still the disconnect.
No, but they are though. You can't see. The thing is, I can prove this to you. So if we were to fire your neurons in a specific way, you would imagine certain things, right? So this is why, like, when people get high, they imagine something differently. It's because their neurons fire in a different way, and they receive certain particles or whatever the nuances are, right? So
Right, but okay.
You can't prove this to me. But the thing is, you can't prove that our neurons don't give us that experience.
Okay, but okay, say I fire a gun, right, and then a bullet comes out. That doesn't mean the bullet's the gun, right, and the gun's the bullet. Okay, when a neuron fires, I have a unique thought or experience, okay? But that does not mean my unique thought or experience is identical to this neurological firing, right? Because by Leibniz identity law, for two things to be identical, they have to have the same properties, right? And you can spatially locate where the neuron is in the firing, but you're not going to be able to locate where spatially my thought is occurring that seems to coincide with this firing, right, and correlate. And you can't causally explain yet in the level of detail as to how the neurological firing transforms into the what I would say is the immaterial experience of, you know, whatever I'm thinking, for instance, or feeling. So there's that disconnect. You can't say they're the two things because they're not sharing all the same properties, right? When the neurons fire and you can observe that, all right, that's not the same thing. It's not the same as a thought, for instance, or what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling, because they have completely different qualities and properties. I think we can all inherently agree, and not to mention too, the one's spatially located in XYZ coordinates, and one as of yet, or I think as forever it will be, cannot be spatially located through coordinates. I would challenge you to through coordinates, the XYZ system, to pinpoint exactly where my emotions and where my thoughts I'm thinking right now are.
Yeah, if I could access your brain and cut it open and look at each individual neuron, that's where it would be.
Okay, well, also too, what do you think about the claims that people have about like out of body experiences? Right, you see all these various stories about people who have astral projections, right, where they have a near-death experience and they can see themselves looking down at their body, right, and they come up as this, some would say as a soul, for instance, or somebody is seemingly thinking in the center of their thoughts in that moment doesn't appear to be within their skull. How do you explain such phenomenon?
Oh, literally, it's just the phenomenon of us experiencing something different. That being the neurons. Sorry, the neurons are firing different, and that this is why we perceive out of body experiences is because of certain firing neurons. Because there's even been a test of this to see if out of body experiences can are you really being out of body? Because sorry. What scientists did is that they had a patient lying down, right? And the thing is, they had above the patient, so they couldn't see, they had an object, right? So when they had the out-of-body experiences and they could see their body, they weren't able to know what that object was, hinting that they weren't actually seeing themselves, rather an interpretation of what they're doing at the time or what activity they're participating in. Dreams function in the same way, and it's not actually like materialistic things. Rather, this is idealism. Dreams are idealism. Not really, but if you know what I mean. But these are neurons firing in a different way, creating these effects.
Okay, but you would agree that there's a disconnect between my thoughts and the neurons firing, and that currently with science we cannot spatially locate my thoughts.
No, I would say your thoughts are where your certain neurons are firing.
Okay, well, you're saying they're the same thing as the neurons firing?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be like saying, I think this is kind of what we're doing, right? We're looking at a gun and it's firing, and I'm looking at the bullet and I'm like, hey, look, the bullet is this, right? But you're saying, no, the bullet's not that, right? So we're talking about the same thing, right? But the thing is, we can measure this. That was a horrible analogy. Sorry about that.
Right, but the neuron firing isn't the same thing as the interpreted thought. They don't have the same property. I don't see how you can genuinely say that the neuron firing is the same as me, thinking cheeseburger, or me thinking up the response I'm going to give you mentally and then interpreting that and consciously understanding that and comprehending that. They don't have the same makeup. How are they identical? I don't understand that. You could say one causes the other. I could see that maybe you could describe, right? But I don't see how you say they're one and the same.
No, funny thing. Actually, your cheeseburger example is a piece of evidence for my point. So, sorry. So what we actually did is we looked at science. This is like cutting edge science. We looked at the brains of people, and by we I mean scientists. They looked at the brains of people, and they saw, based on where the neurons were firing, they were able to establish what the participants were thinking of, and like, so we can know. Like, of course, we only know a certain amount of words for now, but this is just because this is cutting edge science. But we actually can know what you're thinking because of your electrons firing, right? So they are the same thing.
Right, you can purport a correlation between the two, right? You can say, okay, when this neuron's firing, this person self-reports that he is thinking of, say, this word simultaneously, right? But yet the neuron firing is not the same as cheeseburger, and no one can actually objectively know what that person is directly thinking. It's based on self-reportion. Like, you're not seeing into that man's mind and experiencing the thought as he experiences it. There's still a disconnect. They're not one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, no, yeah, we don't know that yet, but this is cutting edge science, right? And we're already going in the direction in which we can understand this.
Right, so you would agree, okay, even by your model, okay, say the neurons caused the thought cheeseburger. The thought cheeseburger is still not the neurons firing that caused the thought cheeseburger. And that thought cheeseburger cannot be experienced directly as that person is experiencing it, and you cannot spatially locate it.
I disagree with almost all of that, for sure, because you do know where you're experiencing things. These are the neurons, right? So this is why we're able to tell what people are thinking based on how their neurons are firing and where they're firing. And the thing is, it's kind of like saying, you see the experience you have of experience things is inherently still materialistic because these are neurons firing again, making you experience your experience in a certain way.
Right, but how are you saying that? Right? Okay, when they do the experiment, right, where they, trigger this neuron or this certain part of the brain to fire, and then they go, aha, he's saying, well, I don't know what the exact word was in this experiment, which you haven't sourced, but let's say it's cheeseburger, right? They don't go, yeah, I just thought and experienced cheeseburger the same way he thought and experienced cheeseburger. It's a success, guys. We know it. This is where it's spatially located. They probably asked the recipient, hey, what are you thinking right now? And he goes, damn, when you fire that, instantly I thought cheeseburger. And they do it with another person, and the same result happens. Like, what did you think? And you're like, damn, I said cheeseburger. So they actually have to ask the participant, hear what he says, and what is caused by this neuron firing, what he experienced. They don't share this experience, have it spatially stored somewhere through a coordinate system, and know it exactly as he knew it.
Wait, no, we do, though. We inherently do. This is why we can measure it, and this is why we can perceive it, right? So we're just trying to find out if it's there, right? That doesn't mean it's not there. We can prove that it is there. But Lucian, you were going to try to say something?
Okay, so I was gonna say, okay, you guys go back and forth on the neuron thing a lot, but let's flip the argument and still make it directed at idealism, just kind of in a little bit inverse way. So one of the things about this whole idea that we can capture consciousness by observing, the firing of neurons or some type of neurological pattern that says, hey, you're actually thinking this thought at this time, is an interesting idea. However, when you go down the path of idealism and you're making arguments, to be is to be, or to be is to be perceived, you are not subsequently. I'm just curious about your argument. I know it can be made very many ways. But how do you reconcile the fact that we don't see a disembodied consciousness, which can be verified objectively? It's like if to be is to be perceived and you cannot perceive this, then how do you connect the gaps there? Because that's one of the stronger supporting lines of materialism. And if you're going to argue against materialism, you have to refute that statement.
So you're asking how to explain my consciousness if I cannot dissect my consciousness? Is that what you're trying to say?
The idea is that if your consciousness is not in some way, shape, or form taking on a physical manifestation and that can be observed, then it's like, in what way would you have the ability to even be able to perceive your consciousness? Little less the fact that we cannot perceive our consciousness as a physical entity outside of ourselves or in other people. So it's like, how do you reconcile that?
Well, I would say I experience things through a variety of senses and means, right? Like, just I can confirm things as existing within my reality through things other than sight, for example. I can hear things, I can smell things, I can, feel things. And so I would say consciousness can be confirmed through my own experience of my stream of thought, right? Like, who you are, like, for instance, in Buddhism, I believe is considered a 5 aggregates, right? So you have, your mental train of thoughts, you have your mental state of mind and your emotions, which are associated with that. And you have your physical body, in which is inhabited or observed. Okay, like I can see and sense it. Like I can feel my physical body. I can interact with it. I can smell my body. I can, even hear when my body creaks. For instance, when I walk up the stairs. And then, So, and then I have I suppose the stream in which this is coming from as well. I forget the exact 5 arguments. I did look it up. But I have all these things, right, in which I'm interacting with it, I'm sensing and I'm experiencing, right? Like consciousness really at its core, I suppose, is just a train of thoughts and sense. That's the other part of who you are, I suppose, is what you're sensing, what you're bringing in, what data is coming to you. So all these things together are making up who I am, and all these things as well are directly experienced and sensed by me. So therefore I can confirm their existence. So, and this is perfect. What are you going to say?
But all of your senses, all those things that you described of sensing and the ability to sense, they are all neurological in the sense of you are experiencing them materially through the firing of neurons or through just actual physical experience. So it's like you justify idealism through a material medium that isn't based solely on perception.
Right, but for instance, my thoughts or emotions, right? Like when I feel anger and I sense anger, or I feel love and I sense love, or I'm having a train of conscious thought, right? How does this happen and explain through a material process? Like, for instance, when I'm angry or loving someone, right, it has intention. How would you explain how a bunch of atoms and molecules could arrange themselves in a manner and then acquire intention, right, and be about something, right? How are atoms or something material that's not consciously thinking have any intention? That would be my one counter argument. The other counter argument too is I'm sensing things like my emotions and like my thoughts in a non-spatial manner. You can't coordinate position where my thoughts or emotions are located. You can't say, oh yeah, at 83x, 23y, negative 53z, that's where love is, right there, located for, this individual, 1135,
Wait, no, I can though. I can just if you would let me cut open your brain, I could go to each neuron and I could go to each of I don't know what specifically they're called, but the stem cells or whatever you call it. And I can point them out here. I can be like, yeah, those this is where you're having this experience.
Right. You could through your model showcase where synapses are located that coincide and correlate with the mental experiences, right, or the thoughts or the emotions, right? Yet these synapses and these neurological firings are not identical because they don't share all the same properties as the experience. There's a huge disconnect between the wavelength red and the experience of redness, the qualia. Qualia is something unique to you that's experienced. It's not something that can be objectified scientifically.
No, it can though. No, the thing is, okay. So it's not that this doesn't disprove anything, right? You're just experience certain things differently, right? So if you have the information on what red is, you might not know what red is, but you know what it is in a different sense, right? But if you look at red, you understand it through your neurons firing. See, and I can even prove this. If you cut off certain parts of the brain, you're not able to perceive certain things when you cut off certain parts of the brain. You're not able to engage in certain activities, right? This is even more evidence to my point that it is a materialistic thing rather than some arbitrary metaphysical thing.
Okay, I have a response to that. Okay, you're in a room, right, Dex? And since birth, I removed the experience of red. You can't see red, okay? So you have no idea what red looks like, but you can see all the other colors. And you're in this room, right, and I give you all this textbooks, and I drill you, right, okay, the wavelength of red is this, all right? This is everything that's red in life, and you're still not seeing the red, but I tell you things that would be red, okay? And I tell you all the physical interactions and properties of red and everything that we can scientifically study, okay? And we go through this for years and years, and we do this in this room, right, where we isolate, right? We're not allowing you to see it, okay? Would your knowledge of red be complete? Do you know what red is at that point?
See, but this is different from what we're talking about.
No. This is
once again. This is very important to understand because these are different experiences. You can make the same comparison and be like, "That's green. Do you know what red is now?" You know what I mean? They're not the same experience. Do you understand that at least?
I would prefer you answer my question first, right? If you're in that room and you physically study everything about redness, but you still mentally don't have the conscious experience of redness, right? You've never seen the color red. Do you know what red is? Are you missing something, or do you perfectly understand what red is?
You would not have the experience of what red is. Your neurons wouldn't have fired to experience red in the way that they would have.
So you would lack the experience even though physically you would know everything about red.
Well, no, you don't physically know everything about red because your neurons haven't fired when you saw red. I would submit that you can't know completely about red until you see the color red because your neurons have to fire in that way in order for you to understand red in the way that you're describing.
But I think as a resulting point, though, on the materialist side of things, we can firmly conclude that consciousness is affected by materialistic changes. Like let's kind of like I don't know, this argument about red and being able to stay away from stuff. Oh, hey, someone look at general. This argument from being able to look at red and do stuff as such. It's a valid argument, but I would also interject that damage to the brain done in like a physical car wreck or like other type of not EKGs, but electromagnetic stimulations and drug inducements and all these other kind of things. It's going to affect and shape your consciousness, which means in order for it to shape or have some type of effect on your consciousness, there has to be a materialistic link into your consciousness, which means that your consciousness has to be fundamentally linked materially to you and who you are. So you don't necessarily just get to remove the whole, well, I experience things, but that doesn't mean that I can't measure it material. If by the material we can completely screw up what you experience.
Come again. There was a server thing I needed to react really quickly, but can you say again?
Yeah. No. Basically, the idea is that consciousness is affected by material changes. Simple idea is that I give you a shot to go to sleep, and then I have a surgery on you. It's like your consciousness is affected by material changes. You have to deal away with that.
No, I would 100% submit that your consciousness is a materialistic things, and those neurons firing is consciousness.
Yeah, I'm making this in the direction of idealism, not materialism.
So there's a couple of responses to that, Lucian, I suppose you could have. One from the idealist school would be to say that all those physical happenings, right, corresponding and correlating with these mental realities and experiences could be as a result of your consciousness believing that should be the case, right? Like, for instance, in the Matrix, right, they're in the simulation, and then when Neo gets punched really hard, right, he actually, his nose bleeds in the real world, and he really feels the pain, right? And when he asks Morpheus, like, what the fuck's happening? It's supposed to be a simulation. How's it affecting my mental state? And Morpheus would say, well, it's because your brain and your consciousness thinks it should respond and feel this way because it believes it to be real. It's still stuck within the illusion, and so it's going to behave as if it were in the illusion, if it were real. So there's that, argument there where the consciousness, I suppose, in the mind is just corresponding to the physical reality it created for, or the immaterial reality it created for itself, but it appears to be real. So that's one argument. Another argument you would even take to still argue for immaterial things to exist is you could take the Barak de Spinoza's argument that everything is simply correlation, is perfectly synchronized together, right? So when you have a mental experience, right, say like you go unconscious because you were given this drug, right? It actually wasn't as a result of the drug causing that. It was because the mental experience correlated and happened simultaneously with the physical interaction or experience, and that they don't have a causal relation. Everything's just a very tight correlation. So I mean, both could be used to explain that.
But here's sorry, I was reading. Here's the ultimate, like, the deal that you just made, though, is that okay, so you're justifying consciousness while allowing the externalized world to be type of shrouded in superstition. So to me, it does not make sense that we have this ability to suddenly just output some type of rationale for, hey, guess what? I think that because of my consciousness and my subjective experiences and all these other kind of things, but I'm going to dismiss all these physical experiences as well. So what I'm saying is, specifically, there's not a particular reason to justify considering consciousness to be any different. Why do you justify the reason to consider consciousness any different? How do you make the distinguish little factor between your consciousness and that which is external? It's like, where do you start drawing that line then?
Well, things are immaterial or things are not, spatially located because we have yet to determine where they are within the XYZ plane. I mean, that's going to be the big way in which you would normally do it. But I mean, from an idealist perspective, I would say everything in which we know and experience is going to be ultimately an idea within our head because we're experiencing everything through the filters of our mind, right? We're not interacting with things objectively. If you could say anything or describe anything in reality without using something you acquired through the filter of your mind through senses, I would like to hear it.
Tag that last line again.
Like explain. Okay, describe a tree, for instance, to me without using something that was acquired through the filter of your mind and through the five senses, and that is therefore can't be viewed objectively because it's going through the subjective filter of your mind that's been proven through hallucinations and illusions to be faulty and unreliable. Like I can prove that everything's ultimately at the very least an idea in my head because I'm experiencing it, but yet how can you explain that these things are in reality? That that as I'm seeing things, that's directly how it is in reality. Because I have no way of interacting with direct reality because there's this veil of perception around everything, right? I'm experiencing everything through the filter of my mind and through my senses. And they're coming and being told to me by my brain, and I know my brain to be unreliable. So consequently, I have no way of knowing if it's reflective of true reality because there's this veil in the way. And I'm not sure how you can see beyond the veil and tell me objectively about a physical world that's independent of what I'm experiencing.
Well, one of the arguments that comes to my mind is kind of playing with retrocausality. And if we remove the idea of immediate if we insert the idea of immediate experience and then remove the idea of retrocausality and remove the idea of memory and everything else, like let's say what you're perceiving, and then suddenly you're perceiving a tree, you have no descriptive vocabulary, no type of anything to be able to describe that tree exists, and then when you turn around and look the other way, you don't see the tree. Does that mean that the tree does not exist? The problem that I have is that you do not get to dismiss every other type of material object with just simply saying that, because I have this shroud or I have this type of veil of perception that, maybe it does, or maybe it does, or maybe it does not exist. Like, I understand what the argument to this would be, where like I see the tree, I describe it, and then I come back later in time and I see the same tree again and I describe it, and you have memory, you have stored up consciousness, you experience over time, and time is in my book another sense. But the point is still there, is that if you turn around, does the tree just stop existing? What I'm trying to get at specifically is that there has to be a hard line. Something is existing externally from you that when you stop perceiving it, it is still in existence, even if you couldn't describe it.
So you're saying one of your problems, I suppose, with an idealistic model is how do things maintain continuity, right? Like like when I light a candle in a room, right, and it's burning, okay, then I go out and I get some groceries, I do some shit, I come home, the candle's been burnt down a lot more, the wax has continued to melt as I've been gone. I was not observing it, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I mean, yeah, basically.
Okay, well, I would say that it's kept intact by a subconscious mind, which is keeping all these matters intact. And you can tell this too, okay? Like, for instance, when you have a dream, right? I mean, have you never had a dream where you're experiencing all the events that are transpiring, you wake up and you're in the waking world for a little bit, then you go back to bed, and then the dream continues where you left off, and somehow your subconscious machinations have managed to keep that all going? Right, so I would say the world wider as we experience it in the awakened world operates in the same way, where a subconscious mind, either a collective subconscious or individual subconscious, if you're a solipsist thinker, keeps everything consistent and operating it keeps everything together, right? And so George Berkeley would say this subconscious would be God, and so it would be God that would keep everything together. If you want to be theistic about it, although you don't have to use theistic terminology, I don't think.
Okay, so my objection, because if you bring in God into this, then my objection's just done. But my objection,
you don't have to bring God into it. I'm just
no. The idea that your subconscious is like tracking with these lines of thoughts, and somehow just like someone an accountant going crazy with everything that has to be kept up in memory for something that has occurred, or to be reoccurred, or to be occurring on a certain time frame. It's like, what if okay, so two arguments. One, what if I had a candle that burned at a faster rate than another candle, but I didn't know? But see, it wouldn't matter if I didn't know, as long as one of the candles lower and one of the candles higher, then guess what? It's over. So that argument's kind of sketchy. Better argument, if there is this little subconscious, man who's an accountant who's going absolutely crazy trying to keep up with every task that you have to burden him with, and usurping or saying that it's not God, because man, if it is, then this argument's trash. But if you're going to make that claim, then what if I just went to every single house ever, and I set up a little thing, a candle, some kind of drawing, some type of mosaic, something that only I know about, and I put it everywhere? It's like, then can you overload the subconscious? How can you measure it? How can you know? It's like, wait a minute, like, how do you just get away with doing that?
Well, if you're wondering about the processing power of the subconscious, I mean, I suppose you could ask the same question about the universe. How is the universe and all of its laws of physics able to keep everything continuous and operating as well? I mean, what's the computing power of the universe? I mean, that's just as valuable or a similar question to what's the computing power of this subconscious mind.
What kind of idealism are you guys talking about?
Subjective idealism, I guess.
Okay.
Do you have anything to add about it? I think you just jumped in, didn't you, a little bit ago?
I mean, I just want to make sure we weren't like thinking of idealism as just being something concerned, or just something stating like the non-existence of external objects, because there's forms of idealism that allow for that.
Well, like even Kantian idealism, right? Didn't he say they're likely objects outside of our mind that are existing independent of our experience? We just have no like meaningful way to describe them.
It's an epistemic account. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would subscribe to. I mean, there could be things outside of our mind that are independent, but we have no meaningful way of describing interacting with them because we're doing everything through the filter of our mind and our consciousness and our senses, that are faulty.
I don't know. I don't find the idealism realism debate. I don't know why it says materialism. That's weird. But like, yeah, I don't know. I don't find the idealism realism debate to be that interesting. Like, nothing turns on either of them being true.
I mean, we're just having this event. If you don't want to participate in the event, no one's forcing.
No, I'm not saying I don't want to participate in it. Just giving my input.
Well, yeah.
I mean, it also bleeds into the argument of consciousness to like philosophy of mind type stuff, where we're talking about is the mind and consciousness immaterial, right, or is it ultimately going to be explained entirely through materialism? Then maybe you can help with this gridlock. We kind of get to the situation where Dex will say, yeah, everything that's immaterially experienced, I would say is immaterially experienced. Like, like say your thoughts or your emotions are going to be boiled down to synaptical firings, or it's going to be boiled down to chemical reactions. Well, I would say that Leibniz law states for two things to be identical, they have to all have the same identical properties. And one's spatially located, one's not spatially located. One can have intent, the other can't have intent. And simultaneously, they're not quite the same.
I mean, like, first we need to know what's meant by physical or material, because a lot of times it's ill-defined and or it's ambiguous and or it's vacuous, right?
So I would think something that is material is something that can be measured, right? So it's not necessarily something that we can see, because we can't see air, but we can measure it. So it'd be something that we can measure, and then we can.
Is it something that could be measured as of right now, or what?
I mean, anything that you measure has to be measured right now, right?
What I'm saying is there could be something that we aren't capable of quote unquote measuring that exists, and you still intuitively want to refer to it as material if it is something like a spatial location, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So,
for sure.
So I guess what are you saying then? Are you saying something that's capable of being measured right now, or what?
Something that can be measured in the future as well as now.
Yeah. So what's your metric for determining that, and what does it mean to measure?
What do you mean by that?
Well,
your first point, I know what does it mean to measure, but what do you mean by your first point?
Yeah, so I don't know, how are you going to determine something is capable of being measured?
If we can measure it, right?
Well, and I understand that, but again, the point is like,
how do you measure something? Is that your
question? I'm asking, like, you want to say, well, this thing can be measured, and this thing 100% can't be measured, right? I'm asking how you decide that, because there's this weird problem that a lot of materialists run into, or physicalists run into, when they try to say, try to say that the only thing that's material is that which is measurable. Well, it might just turn into a vacuous definition if they just grant that everything could be measured, or don't actually have a criteria for deciding how something's measurable and how it's not, right?
Yeah, I accept that for sure. But the thing is, it's sort of like using the logic with the God in the gaps argument, right? So just because science can't comprehend something doesn't mean that it's like this is now true. You know what I mean? I'm
not making any argument like that.
I understand you're not making the God in the gaps argument, but it's extremely similar in that regard.
Well, I mean, oddly enough, I think it might be the reverse, because you would be inclined to say something like, well, just because science, can't measure it, doesn't mean that it, doesn't exist. Maybe in the future science could measure it, but like, again, you're just sort of assuming that. I just want to know by what metric you're going to say that something is measurable or not measurable. Because if you don't have a metric, then either everything somehow becomes physical, or like you don't really have a principal distinction at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand that, and my position actually has been kind of changed throughout this whole conversation. I just think you can't be a materialist, idealist, or in the thing you can't verify any of these things. But I mean, I honestly don't. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to respond to it for sure.
Yeah, I don't. The problem is that when you say like, oh yeah, you can't be a materialist, but like we don't even know what materialist means anymore because we can't give an account of what material even is.
So I guess
what physically means, right?
I guess I would say everything that'd be measurable, we think you could either get quantitative or qualitative data out of. So either you're going to have numbers about something, right? You're going to be discussing, like, say, its volume, its weight, its height, its length, blah, blah, blah. Things which you're going to have actual numbers on, or it's going to be qualitative data, which is things in which you're going to describe with your five senses. And I don't think those are the only ways in which you can measure things, I would say.
So I'm confused. Is extension the only thing that's required, and like the five senses thing is like an extra thing, or are they both required?
No, I would say to measure something, you either measure something by a qualitative or quantitative means, right? Like if I'm going to measure how sour something is, right, I'm not going to have the sour scare probably. I'm just going to be able to taste it. I'm going to go, wow, that was more sour than this thing because I experienced this and that. Or I'm going to like get out a rule and I'm going to use quantitative data and measurement, right? I'm going to say, okay, this is this centimeters long, for instance.
Okay, so how are we going to determine whether or not something is, capable of fitting into that, either being quote unquote measurable, which might just be, hashed out by extension, or just detectable by the senses?
How are we going to determine that? Well, through experience.
Well, I mean, seemingly there's things that are, lie outside of what we're capable of experiencing right now that you'd still be inclined to say are existing, maybe, right?
Like what?
I mean, like a galaxy a bazillion miles away, maybe?
Well, we experience that through seeing it through a telescope.
Yeah, but I'm assuming like bazillion miles away means like the telescopes aren't capable of reaching them,
Well, how do you know it's there then?
What?
Maybe it's not there.
So like when telescopes can't see far enough, reality ceases to exist?
Maybe not. But maybe it doesn't exist, but you can't say it does until you have experiential proof.
I want to give a really good example. Okay, so for example, we weren't able to know that other galaxies existed, like just by looking at the sky without a telescope. Like certain planets, like planets we can name by like the numbers, right? We didn't know these things existed, but they did exist. I think that would be a better example.
One, I was being agnostic to things existing. If you can experience it, maybe they do, but I don't think you can say something for sure exists unless you can verify it through experience. I think experience is the basis of all knowledge. And then two, I would say, those things, those still would be measurable, even if I can't describe them as of right now, because they would still, in theory, be able to be measured quantitatively or qualitatively.
Yeah, but how do you determine whether or not something could be measured quantitatively or qualitatively? I just want to know the metric for that.
I suppose it would have to exist spatially for one, because if something's
I don't.
Shit, I mean, there's things I experience qualitatively, I suppose, that aren't spatially locatable.
I guess. The question is like, what are the properties of these things that are capable of being measured, right? Because if you can't give an account of what those properties are, then it doesn't seem like you have an account or a good account of what's physical or material.
Well, I guess it would be things that you would be able to detect through senses, or it would be things that you could actually acquire numbers of.
Yeah, but we're just putting like the could in there. Like we're not like setting up boundaries for this could, because then it seems like it could be vacuous and everything could like be measured, right? Unless we have some sort of reason as to why they couldn't.
Well, I guess things to be quantitatively measurable would have to be spatially located. So I guess that'd be one criteria for that.
Yeah, but you said qualitatively as well, quote unquote. I don't know.
Qualitatively.
You mentioned that, right?
Well, qualitative
Assalamu alaikum.
Oh my god.
Okay.
I'm like rapidly. It's an idealism realism debate, and now it's a physicalism, whether or not that's tenable, and we're just looking at the definition of what physical
Wait, who's
means.
debating who?
It's more of just a conversation, but like I don't know. Like,
Yeah, but
losing
now
interest.
that it is, the conversation is moving on. I would think Merlin would it probably be like a good time to wrap up the event and then have this conversation in voice chat.
Okay.
We're getting away from the topic.
What's going on now?
Dex just asked if he thought it was a good idea to end the recording, I guess. Is that what you're saying, Dex?
Yeah, I'm trying. I don't know if Merlin's trying to talk. Merlin, if you are, your mic's not. Sure
Yes.
thing. So then, I think it's like, my position definitely has changed. I was a materialist, but now I'm just agnostic to all of it because I think there's just simply no way we can know whether it's truly material, dualistic, or immaterial. Material for sure.
So I guess I'll just give my wrapping argument. I mean, I still believe in what I believe because I agree more of like, I guess, a Kantian type of idealism where I would say that the reality in which we know and experience it is happening through the filter of our mind, right? And so consequently, everything is simply just an idea in our head, and it's up to our subjectivity, and it could be in reality as we experience it, it could be very close. It could be the true reality of everything could be vastly different. And I can't tell you what the true reality is because I have no meaningful way to describe it or interact with it. So I don't know about that. All I know is the reality in which I experience is entirely based upon the immaterial creations of my conscious mind. So as a consequence, I would say this reality is immaterial in nature.
Awesome.
And
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, our live audience for joining us. You can find us at the Roundtable Discord by Googling us. You can check out our Twitch stream. We've also got Instagram, Facebook, and we're on many other social media platforms. Please join our server. If you're listening to us, we want to hear from you. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and jump up to one of the chat rooms. We can go join the pub or Roundtable 1 and continue the conversation. Thank you.
But I kind of wanted to hear what other people who were just listening in as a fly on the wall, what they were thinking.
Most people are flies on the wall, but maybe next time. Hopefully they'll chime in our discussion up in the next chat rooms. But thanks, guys.
Okay.